There is a plant growing in the cracks of your driveway right now. Thick green leaves, reddish stems, low to the ground. It has been eaten by humans for over 4,000 years. Ancient Egyptians cultivated it along the Nile River delta. Hippocrates prescribed it to his patients in classical Athens. Chinese physicians documented its healing properties more than 1,500 years ago. Today, it sells for real money in produce markets from Istanbul to Beijing. It is one of the most nutritionally dense leafy greens ever tested in a laboratory. At least, that's the case in most of the world. In North America, people spray it with Roundup. At least, that's what everyone thought it deserved. The plant is called Purslane, and its story is one of the strangest reversals in the entire history of food. If you had asked any farmer tending crops along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 2,000 years before the Common Era what purslane was, they would have told you it was dinner. They had no idea that one day an entire continent would declare war on it with herbicide. Archaeologists working at prehistoric cave sites in the eastern Mediterranean have pulled purslane seeds from layers of sediment dating back thousands of years. These weren't random wild seeds blown in by the wind. The concentrations suggest intentional collection, possibly even early cultivation. The small, succulent leaves of Portulaca oleracea were being gathered and eaten long before wheat fields stretched across Mesopotamia, long before anyone figured out how to ferment barley into beer. And purslane had something going for it that most other wild greens did not. It grew everywhere. Rocky soil, sandy riverbanks, disturbed ground near settlements. While early humans struggled to coax fragile grain crops out of temperamental soil, purslane just showed up on its own, dense with moisture, packed with nutrients, and nearly impossible to kill. In a world where famine was one bad season away, a plant like that was not a nuisance, it was survival. Ancient Persia embraced purslane as both food and folk remedy. Across the Indian subcontinent, early Ayurvedic practitioners ground it into pastes and tonics for digestive ailments and skin irritation. The Egyptians cultivated it deliberately in irrigated garden plots along the fertile Nile floodplain, alongside lettuce and onions. In a civilization obsessed with preserving the body for the afterlife, purslane was considered a plant that kept the living body strong. And that wasn't even the part that got people paying attention across the ancient world. Because purslane's real reputation was about to be built not by farmers, but by physicians. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the Greek physician Hippocrates, the man whose name still sits on every medical school oath, was prescribing purslane to patients on the island of Kos. He recommended it for inflammation, for fevers, and for what he described as an excess of heat in the body. Greek humoral medicine divided the world into hot, cold, wet, and dry, and purslane fell squarely into the cold and wet category. Eaten raw or applied as a poultice, it was believed to cool the blood, soothe internal swelling, and calm an agitated stomach. This was not fringe thinking. This was mainstream Greek medical practice, endorsed by the most influential physician in Western history. A few centuries later, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder picked up where Hippocrates left off. In his sprawling encyclopedia Naturalis Historia, Pliny documented purslane as a remedy for everything from headaches to bladder problems. He also noted that Roman soldiers carried it on long marches, eating it raw from the fields alongside the dusty roads stretching from Rome to the outer provinces of the empire. The plant needed no cultivation, no watering, no special treatment. It simply grew wherever the legions walked, thriving in the trampled, sun-baked ground behind the marching columns. I mean, think about that for a second. Roman soldiers, the most disciplined military force the ancient world had ever seen, were fueling themselves on a plant that most modern Americans consider garbage. But purslane's story in the ancient world was not limited to the Mediterranean. Thousands of miles to the east, Chinese physicians were documenting its properties in traditional medicine texts dating back to at least the 7th century. They called it Ma Qi Xian and used it to treat dysentery, skin sores, and intestinal parasites. It was also eaten as a common vegetable, stir-fried with garlic and sesame oil in kitchens across the Tang dynasty. In traditional Chinese medicine, Purslane was classified as a cooling herb, almost perfectly mirroring how the Greeks had categorized it 1,000 years earlier on the other side of the world. Two civilizations, separated by continents and centuries, looked at the same plant and reached the same conclusion. That kind of convergence does not happen by accident. Now, purslane could have stayed a medicinal curiosity. It didn't. Across the medieval period in Europe, purslane became a fixture of the common kitchen garden. In England, France, and the Low Countries, it was grown alongside parsley, sorrel, and chervil. It appeared in soups, salads, and pickled preparations that families packed away for the lean winter months. The English herbalist Nicholas Culpeper, writing in the 1600s, praised purslane in his famous text, The English Physician. He recommended it for hot stomachs, inflamed livers, and burning fevers. He also suggested it could cool the blood and spirits and soothe anyone suffering from what he called excessive passions. Meanwhile, across the Ottoman Empire, purslane was not just a side dish. It was the star. Turkish cooks prepared it in yogurt-dressed salads that remain popular in Istanbul to this day. Lebanese and Palestinian families made fattoush with fresh purslane leaves, tossing them with sumac, lemon, and toasted flatbread. In parts of the Middle East, asking someone to remove purslane from a garden would have been like asking them to throw away fresh tomatoes. The idea simply did not compute. This decision to cultivate purslane seemed small at the time across these cultures. It was not. Because what happened next reveals how a plant goes from being essential to being invisible. When European colonists crossed the Atlantic Ocean to settle in North America, they packed purslane seeds alongside their other provisions. This was a deliberate choice. They were bringing a known food crop to an unfamiliar continent. The colonists planted it in their early settlement gardens from Massachusetts to Virginia, and it grew beautifully in the warm American summers, spreading across the cleared land with the same aggressive enthusiasm it had shown everywhere else on Earth for millennia. And the colonists were not even the first people on the continent to eat it. Indigenous communities across Mexico and the American Southwest had their own native species of purslane, called verdolagas, that they had been consuming long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. In Mexico, verdolagas were cooked with pork and green salsa, a dish that still shows up on dinner tables today. The plant was at home in the Americas long before anyone tried to bring it here. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Purslane grew in colonial American gardens alongside beans, squash, and corn. That didn't last. Something shifted over the next 2 centuries. It happened slowly, then all at once. As American agriculture industrialized in the 1800s, farming moved away from small, diversified plots and toward massive single-crop operations. Wheat, corn, cotton. The fields got bigger, the crops got fewer, and anything that was not the intended crop became the enemy. Purslane, with its aggressive growth habit and ability to colonize any scrap of bare soil, went from garden vegetable to agricultural pest in the span of a few generations. It was no longer a useful green that fed the family. It was a weed choking the cash crop. The same resilience that made purslane a survival food for ancient civilizations, its ability to grow anywhere, in any soil, under brutal sun, now made it a target. The same trait that built purslane's reputation was about to destroy it, at least in one country. By the early 20th century, the United States Department of Agriculture had classified purslane as a noxious weed. Multiple states listed it among their most problematic invasive plants. County extension agents published guides on how to eradicate it from lawns and farm fields. Chemical herbicide manufacturers marketed their products with images of exactly the kind of low-growing, succulent broadleaf plant that purslane is. The suburban lawn became the symbol of American prosperity after World War II. Manicured grass, perfectly edged, chemically treated to a uniform green. Anything that broke that uniformity was an intruder. Dandelions, clover, crabgrass, and of course purslane. Millions of homeowners across America poured chemicals on the exact same plant that Hippocrates had prescribed to his patients 2,400 years earlier. If you are wondering how that is even possible, so is everyone else who studies the history of food. And while Americans were poisoning purslane in their backyards, the rest of the world kept eating it. Greek villages served horta, a traditional dish of boiled wild greens, with purslane as a central ingredient. Portuguese cooks tossed it into soups alongside potatoes and garlic. In markets across Turkey, bundles of fresh purslane sold by weight right next to the parsley and mint. Indian families in Rajasthan made curries with it. Chinese street vendors stir-fried it with chili and soy sauce. The contrast is almost absurd when you lay it out. In one country, purslane is a weed you kill. In dozens of others, it is a vegetable you buy. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why the story turned around. In 1986, a researcher named Artemis Simopoulos at the Center for Genetics, Nutrition, and Health in Washington, D.C., published findings that would change the scientific conversation about purslane permanently. Her laboratory analysis revealed that purslane contained higher levels of alpha-linolenic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid, than any other leafy green plant ever tested. Not slightly higher, dramatically higher. A single serving of purslane leaves contained more omega-3 fatty acids than some fish oil supplements sitting on pharmacy shelves. The nutritional profile that emerged from subsequent studies was staggering. Purslane contained significant amounts of vitamin A, vitamin C, and vitamin E. It was loaded with magnesium, potassium, calcium, and iron. It contained melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep cycles, and betalain, a potent antioxidant compound. All of this packed into a plant that required zero fertilizer, zero irrigation in most climates, and zero human effort to grow. A plant this nutrient-dense, growing freely in backyards across the hottest, driest parts of the planet, quietly rewriting everything nutritional science thought it knew about wild edible greens. So yeah, not a typical weed. And purslane had one more biological trick that scientists found genuinely bizarre. Most plants use a single photosynthetic pathway to convert sunlight into energy. The vast majority of leafy greens use what is called C3 photosynthesis, a process that works well in moderate temperatures but becomes inefficient in extreme heat. Desert-adapted plants like corn and sugarcane use C4 photosynthesis, which handles heat and drought much better but is almost never found in leafy vegetables. Purslane uses both. Under normal conditions, it runs C3 photosynthesis like a typical garden green. When temperatures spike and water becomes scarce, it switches to C4, and when nighttime arrives, it can even shift into a third mode called CAM photosynthesis, the same pathway used by cacti in the Sonoran Desert. 3 photosynthetic modes in a single plant. Botanists at the University of Arizona and other research institutions published paper after paper trying to figure out how purslane pulled this off, because almost nothing else in the plant kingdom does it. This biological flexibility is exactly why purslane thrives on every continent except Antarctica. It survives conditions that kill most other food crops. And in an era when climate change is already threatening global agricultural yields, that ability is not a curiosity. It is potentially critical. If purslane had stopped surprising researchers there, this would be a very different story, but it did not stop. By the 2000s, agricultural scientists studying drought-resistant food systems for developing nations started paying serious attention to purslane. Researchers at Purdue University examined it as a potential crop for arid regions in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, places where conventional vegetables struggle with heat and water scarcity. NASA's Advanced Life Support Program at Kennedy Space Center in Florida even evaluated purslane as a candidate crop for long-duration space missions, specifically because it produces dense nutrition in minimal growing conditions. Exactly what you need when you are trying to feed astronauts inside a sealed habitat on a Mars-bound spacecraft. The arc of this story bends toward a realization that keeps getting harder to ignore. For most of recorded human history, virtually every major civilization on Earth recognized purslane as a valuable food. The Egyptians grew it, the Greeks prescribed it, the Romans marched on it, the Chinese cooked with it for over 1,000 years. The Ottomans served it at feasts. Mexican families stewed it with chili and pork. Indigenous communities across multiple continents foraged and cultivated it. And then, in one country, over the course of roughly 150 years, all of that knowledge evaporated. Not because the plant changed, because the culture around it changed. Industrialized farming did not need purslane. Suburban aesthetics did not want purslane. And without anyone making a deliberate decision to forget, an entire continent simply stopped knowing what it was. All right, so here is where things get really interesting, because the tide is starting to turn. In the last 2 decades, purslane has started appearing on menus at high-end restaurants in New York, Los Angeles, London, and Copenhagen. Chefs at farm-to-table establishments prize its slightly tart, peppery flavor and its crunchy, succulent texture. Farmers markets in California and the Pacific Northwest sell small bundles of cultivated purslane alongside microgreens and heirloom tomatoes, often at premium prices. Food writers in major publications from the New York Times to Bon Appetit have published features asking some version of the same question. Why did we stop eating this? If you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. By 2025, the conversation around purslane had expanded beyond restaurants and nutrition labs. Climate scientists and food security researchers were examining purslane as part of a broader effort to identify crops that could withstand rising global temperatures. The plant's ability to produce edible, nutrient-dense leaves in soil too poor and conditions too hot for lettuce, spinach, or kale made it a serious candidate for climate-adapted agriculture. Research teams at institutions across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia were running trials, growing purslane in saline soils and water-stressed environments where other leafy greens simply died. Meanwhile, in backyards across the United States, the very same plant kept doing what it has always done. It pushed through sidewalk cracks in Phoenix, Arizona. It carpeted bare patches of lawn in suburban Dallas, Texas. It spread across empty lots in Detroit, Michigan, and climbed through gravel driveways in rural Ohio. No one planted it. No one watered it. No one wanted it. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about purslane's story. The plant never left. It was always right there, growing in the exact same places it has grown for thousands of years, silently offering the same nutrition it offered to Egyptian farmers and Roman legionnaires and Chinese herbalists and Ottoman cooks. The only thing that changed was whether people bothered to pick it up. Purslane's story is not unique. It follows the same pattern as dozens of other ancestral foods that industrial agriculture displaced. Amaranth, once a sacred crop of the Aztec Empire, became cattle feed. Quinoa, a staple of Andean civilizations for 5,000 years, was dismissed as peasant food until Western health trends turned it into a global commodity. Breadfruit, which Captain William Bligh nearly died trying to transport across the ocean in 1789, sits rotting under trees across the Caribbean while islanders import processed flour. The pattern repeats across cultures and centuries. A resilient, nutrient-dense food that sustained people for generations gets replaced by something more convenient, more marketable, or simply more familiar to the dominant agricultural system. What makes purslane's case especially absurd is that you do not need to import it, cultivate it, or even buy it. For a significant percentage of the people watching this right now, the most omega-3 rich leafy green on the planet is growing within 50 feet of where you are sitting. It has been there the whole time. The ancient physicians called it a healing plant. The modern laboratory confirmed they were right. And somewhere between those two moments, an entire culture looked at one of the most resilient, most nutritious, most historically significant edible plants on Earth, and decided it was garbage. Purslane never stopped being valuable. We just stopped paying attention. If you want to see how another common plant changed the course of human history, that video is on screen now.